Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to Cambridge. I'm happy to see that, well, if the conference is coming to the end, there are still quite many people here around, despite the weather is so nice and of course there is much more to do on Saturday. But we have still one problem to solve. What happened at the end of last year regarding the US presidential elections, we have a new phenomenon called Donald Trump, and all these issues which are related. So at what he intended to change, what he has started to change, what happens, how successful it is, so at the new role of the United States and its potential implications on the Baltic region as well, because we are part of the big picture. And I'm Holger Mölder, representing Tallinn University of Technology. My, let's say, field is international security studies, but here I have just a non-significant role of chair of this panel, but we have the distinguished panelists. Let me introduce you Professor William Hurst, who is a professor on East Asian Studies at the University of Cambridge, and also he's a co-director of the Geopolitical Center here. We have Professor Kasekamp, who is representing now the University of Toronto. He's a professor on history there, but for a long time, of course, we all know he represented University of Tartu. And we have Dr. Timothy Less, who is a senior advisor to the Geopolitics Center and also to Judge Business School here at Cambridge. So we have two people from Cambridge, two outsiders. We have from different nationalities here. There are Estonians, so we have Canadians, we have British, and we have also American representative here. So it looks multinational. And the issue here is, do we face this, I called it the Mad Max world, where we have a lot of wars, different kinds of wars, starting from trade wars, cyber wars, but also shooting wars, cultural wars. So this is a new world Donald Trump is offering us, and so it contains several challenges. The first one is domestic challenge at the United States, reshaping US society according to this Project 2025. And there is also challenge what concerns this international system, which is also replacing this rule-based world with a deal-based world, which is actually the Mad Max world. And here we have several questions, and let's start with the first one. In welcoming to this Mad Max world, if you agree or not with these expressions, and well, actually how successfully Donald Trump has challenged the international world order. Well, because this week we celebrate 100 days of Trump administration. This is still at the beginning. And does it mean the end of our traditions? So it's about the NATO, United Nations, so it's this world which has been built since the end of the Second World War. And and the third issue here is this nationalist protectionist response to the problems pretty much related to globalization, to global issues here. And Please, distinguished panelist, who is ready to start this discussion we will have here. Thank you. Please. Okay, let's start from the left. Andres, please.
Oh, why don't we start from that side, and I can...
Yeah.
Okay, so should we deal with the first question first then? Yeah, the end of the liberal institutions. So I think my headline comment is that someone who has actually a professional obligation to know such things can't give you the clear answer that you want to this. The next chapter in human history has yet to be written, and there are various scenarios ahead. But I think what we can say with some certainty is the following, which is that there once was, and perhaps still is, an identifiable liberal era, which perhaps started around 1989 and continued until sometime recently. There's a debate about when exactly the high point of liberalism was, but I'm going to put a date to it, which is 2007, just before the onset of the financial crisis. And that this liberal era was defined by various precepts, including a kind of commitment to democracy, free trade, global multilateral governance, cooperation between states, which conducted their relations according to sort of agreed norms and rules, an interest in overarching, you could say, sort of planetary issues like poverty, income equality, climate change, all enforced by a hegemonic United States, but that we have been moving out of this liberal era for the last few years, of which there are various milestones that you can track. As I say, I think the financial crisis was probably the turning point. Then you can pass through events like Russia's invasion of Georgia and Ukraine in 2014, and that probably this liberal era reached at least a symbolic end with the election of Donald Trump, and that we're now moving into something else, which we don't quite know what it is, but it's almost certainly not liberalism. And if I was to offer any kind of description of what I think this new era will entail, it will involve some of the following, perhaps all of the following elements, including a return to nationalism, a kind of national policy led by charismatic leaders who are pursuing the explicit goal of achieving or restoring national greatness, a prominent role for at least self-defined civilizational states, including Russia and China, India, the United States, which all possess a kind of strong sense of their distinct culture, history and outlook, which are seeking to establish spheres of influence in their immediate neighborhoods, and whose interrelations will in some sense constitute a Huntington-style clash of civilizations, albeit very imperfectly, because at least for the time being, this is a world in which Russia is in conflict with Orthodox Ukraine, and the US is faltering on its commitment to Christian Europe. I also see ahead a period of international disorder, or at least a lack of clarity about the exact nature of the international order, which is not unipolar because of the rise of China and the United States' abdication of its role as the global policeman. It's not bipolar because of the presence of Russia and other major powers such as India. And it's not obviously multipolar because of the presence of numerous second and third tier actors like Turkey, Britain, France, Germany, South Korea, Japan, Brazil, and I could go on. I also think in this new emerging world order that the abiding operating principle will be realism, meaning states motivated by self-interest rather than the pursuit of more idealistic goals, where the international currency is power, where states are actively trying to amass power by building up their militaries and economies, where they are unafraid to use power in the form of tariffs, sanctions, and even physical force, where agreements are reached on a transactional basis and states are content to renege on traditional alliances if these no longer serve the national interest, and to pursue new partnerships where these promote the national interest. And conversely, I think it's a world where liberalism may not disappear entirely, but it will have much less salience, where states are unlikely to be bound by laws and rules and norms and the multilateral institutions which enforce them if these rules and institutions represent an obstacle to the pursuit of national interests. And I think perhaps we get to the essence of your question here, Holger. I think it is a world which is going to be more dangerous than the one we are leaving, containing ambitious revisionist states which are operating without regard to predictable rules, and which has the potential for an upswing in violence. And we can look around the world and see the various flashpoints from the Balkans to Guyana and other places besides, alongside those conflicts which are already playing out in Ukraine and the Middle East, Caucasus and Africa. But this is also a world where I think the great powers are likely to act with caution in their dealings with one another, not least because of the absence of agreement about the terms of engagement in which the major players are likely to pay respect to each other's spheres of influence, as the US seems to be doing in Ukraine, and refrain from imposing their own cultures and values on others, and in which old-fashioned diplomacy, bilateral rather than multilateral diplomacy, is likely to make a comeback. And I think the final thought I'll offer on this new emerging world is that it is one which is going to be recognizable to us today with strong elements of continuity. There will be multilateral institutions such as the United Nations and the European Union, even if they become less important, not least because of the interests of smaller states in preserving these institutions. There will still be plenty of international trade, overseas investment, large movements of people across borders, even if this is circumscribed by geopolitical imperatives. And international norms will not disappear, even if these are different norms to the ones that we operate by today, since the major states will always have an interest in rules that constrain their rivals, even if to some extent this places a constraint on themselves. Okay, I'll stop there, I'm sure. Well, I'll pass over to the others now.
Okay, thank you so much. Please. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm assuming everyone can hear me. Yes. So let me talk first about security implications, particularly for the Baltic region. And in speaking of the Baltic region, I'm speaking not of Russia, but of the other countries that surround the Baltic Sea. So there are really four aspects to the United States post-2024 election that I think bear some significance for the way things may turn in that part of the world. And steering clear of sort of grand pronouncements about clash of civilizations, which I've never liked actually, I would just first make the point that things like the beginning or the end or the character of liberalism look very different when one looks from a vantage point that isn't Europe. This liberal era never made it to most of the world, at least not the way that I think a lot of people in Europe think it did. But if we think about what Trump has done in security terms first, and if there's a second round, we can come back and talk about trade. These four aspects of it that I would say are important are, first, there's been a concerted turn away from engagement with small and medium powers and allies, and toward engagement with great powers. Now, we saw this in the first Trump term. We've seen this sporadically at different points in American foreign policy, but I think this is very clearly back, that there will be an emphasis on great power engagement rather than on comprehensive dealings with groups of allies or smaller and medium powers. That obviously threatens essentially to cut out of the conversation and of their own game all of the states surrounding the Baltic except for Russia. right? This really would become a US-Russia kind of negotiation in that framework. The second concerning trend is a step away from Europe and particularly from NATO on the part of the United States. Right? The United States has threatened at certain points, or Trump has threatened, to withdraw from NATO, which seems quite drastic and maybe not entirely sane, but he has made that threat several times. There has certainly been a diminution of engagement and trust between the United States and NATO. And there's been a lot of pressure placed by the US on NATO allies to do various things that they don't necessarily want to do, and that's dividing some of them between each other. So this is obviously of great concern to the Baltic region as well. The third trend is sort of subsumed in both of these, and this is a new approach to Russia, right? And there's been a lot of talk in the public discourse and in US politics domestically about what exactly Trump's relationship or attitude towards Russia is, and a lot of disagreement about that. But what I think is definitely fair to say is that the approach by the United States to Russia now has been and will continue to be increasingly different from what it has been over the last 15 or 20 years. It's a much less confrontational relationship, I could say, at the very least, and one that is open much more to not just the kind of great power negotiation and engagement, but potentially actually almost a realignment of what the US sees as its strategic interests vis-a-vis Russia and other states that lie between the US and Russia. And then finally, the fourth issue that I think has to be considered is the erratic or non-systematic nature of policy formation and implementation, particularly in the security sphere in this second Trump administration. And a lot of this is really being driven by kind of spasmodic contortions in response to combinations of palace intrigue and occasional kind of sporadic attention to domestic politics and polls, and often related to issues that have nothing to do directly with European security. Right, so the US is making decisions about security policy kind of on the fly to a much greater extent than it used to or normally would, and it's doing so in response to stimuli that are not really directly related to events on the ground or anything that allies or adversaries or anyone else is saying. A lot of this really can be about who's up and who's down inside the Pentagon leadership, or who is trying to maneuver against which journalist or blogger, or which local political issue has come up in which part of the country that's provoked a lawsuit that's caused something else, that's caused the polls to shift in some other way, or how the tariff implementation has blown up sort of in the face of the administration, at least immediately after they were rolled out, and then there's a reaction to that. None of this has anything to do with the security policies or events happening in the Baltic. Right? I think it's important to bear that in mind, that these shifts in US policy and orientation don't always correlate directly with what we might think sitting here or sitting a bit east of here actually are the key issues and factors. And so that sort of lack of predictability or clear relationship is important. And this all kind of leads to the question of how should others respond? What's the best reaction to this, at least in terms of security policy? And in this area, I think the news is a lot more hopeful, which is that most countries around the Baltic and throughout Europe, I think, have actually taken kind of the best response one could to this set of factors that I've just outlined. Right? There have been increases in defense expenditure. There have been closer ties between European states, between NATO members, not always including the United States, thinking about how to do this. Right? Finland and Sweden have joined NATO in a very important move. Right? So there have been all of the things that one could expect. The question is, what will the result of that be? How will that play for Russia? How will that play for other actors who might be in the region? Although Russia is primarily the actor that I think we're really thinking about when we think about security in the Baltic. And how effective can this really be to deter things like sabotage of gas pipelines or undersea cables? How effective can it be actually to assure small states at the front line that they are not in imminent danger, or that they have taken all necessary steps to forestall any such danger. I'm not sure. But that's where I think security policy sits now. And then in the long term, post-Trump 2, whatever we get to in 2028, 2029, I think the great challenge will be how to reorient the European security order yet again to whatever comes next, or in response to whatever comes next in the United States, and we don't know what that will be, right? So if Trump 1 disrupted things, Biden tried to restore things very much with Europe and spent most of his presidency prioritizing that above all else in American foreign policy, made some progress in that regard, and now it's all been completely upended. What happens next, I don't know, but I think it's important to think at least in these terms and to be ready.
Thank you so much. Anders, please.
All right. First of all, what will the Trumpian world look like? This is just half jokingly. Partly it'll look like us up here on the stage. All the panels will be male, right? That's the future under Trump. That's, so I'm gonna be probably not as optimistic as my fellow panelists, though they probably didn't think they were being optimistic, but they were being, let's say, balanced. I'm gonna try to be a bit more provocative, and picking up on what you said here on the last points, and I think it is, American foreign policy is going to be driven by domestic concerns. So I think it's important to look at how the Trump administration is shaping up. And some of you might know that one of the subjects that I've been teaching for a couple of decades is the history of fascism. And I don't use this word lightly, and it seems to me, I'm going to make the case, that the US under Trump is moving towards a fascist regime at quite a fast clip at the moment. This might sound hysterical. First of all, I'll say I never used the F word regarding Trump in the first term, nor during the election campaign, but the way that it is shaping up now in these last 100 days, it seems to be going in that direction. And it'll be decided within the next few weeks when one of the signs of fascism, of course, is lawlessness, disobeying Supreme Court orders. It's leading, we already are in a constitutional crisis in the United States. So my big argument about the international order, of course, is that it will be shaped by the features, the elements of or the character of the administration, I would use the term regime, domestic regime in the United States. Now, calling it Trump and MAGA fascist, someone will obviously challenge me on this. Now, I've taught this for years, and the typology I usually use is the one by Stanley Payne, which has 13 points. And there's also the Roger Griffin definition, which is much more simpler about the mythical ideological core of fascism being this myth of rebirth after a period of decadence. Well, that's pretty clear in Make America Great Again, the slogan, but that's much too simple. So we take the Stanley Payne, the sort of 13-point sort of checklist, and it used to be that he kind of fulfilled about half of those, and starting from January this year, there are more of those boxes that are being checked. Most obviously, I would have thought that fascism is generally sort of aggressive and expansionist. Trump, we believed until January and in the electoral campaign and Europeans were worried that he would withdraw, right? That he's an isolationist. That's usually been the European concern. Was the concern with George W. Bush as well, that he'd withdraw from Europe. And it's come as quite a surprise, particularly to Canadians, obviously, but not only to Canadians, that Trump genuinely, and he's repeated this now many times, he's not joking, about he has a desire to expand American territory forcibly against the will of America's neighbors and good allies. So there's another item along with the many other most obvious ones, which have come along. It leaves only a very few items in the typical checklist of fascism that are still debatable. Well, one of the ones, for instance, which he doesn't check off, and that's the difficulty in using Stanley Payne's 13-point typology. It's sort of a subjective judgment, right? You fulfill all 13 points different, and then you forget fully Hitler and Mussolini. But of course, one must realize that fascism changes, transforms itself in time and place. It's never going to recreate itself with the little funny mustache and the jackboots. It's going to look differently in a different time and a different national circumstance. But say a few of those points which are still dubious, which probably Trump won't fulfill, was what was specific to the 1920s and 30s, was an exaltation of a younger generation of youth. And that Trump's not really doing that. But that's, you could say, perhaps one of the more trivial and minor elements in fascism. Of course, fascism was about creating a new man, be it like sort of a new Italian in the Mussolini's case, or the biological man in the Nazi case. Trump is not into that as well. Another, of course, a Marxist analysis of fascism would have that fascism is an agent of finance capitalism, but non-Marxist historians, political scientists like Roger Griffin again, would argue that fascism isn't a reactionary ideology, but a revolutionary one. And if you follow that, then putting Trump into the fascist bracket is also difficult, because he seems to be pretty clearly a reactionary, someone who wants to take America back to an imagined past. And not even so imagined. I mean, he talks specifically about President McKinley and the good old days of tariffs and before there was income tax. So he does have a period which was forgotten by most Americans in mind. So that's perhaps another sort of element where I'm sort of trying to found the counter-arguments, which are fairly weak, I think, to say that Trump is not evolving into, at least the MAGA movement certainly is, a genuine fascist. I mean, we all try to avoid overusing that term. It has all this baggage, but I think it has descriptive force in this case. And if that is indeed the characterization of the US administration, or it's moving in that direction, then that has grave implications for the international order, which was outlined by my colleagues here, which means, of course, less international cooperation, all of the bad things that happened in the 1930s. The only thing that sort of seems different in the sense is that Trump does seem to seek to avoid international conflict. He claims to want to be a peacemaker. At other people's expense, of course, but he does indeed want to take over territory, but without force, but against the will of the inhabitants of these territories.
Well, there are definitely so many unpredictable things about Donald Trump, also his intentions to return to the history as well, so that certainly it is, history is something we know, which is clear. But well, it's to go to the history, just facing the future, which is totally different, which is now the globalized world. So that if you can stop globalization, maybe there might be people who believe it, but this is not so easy thing to do. But well, thank you very much for this question. We can continue actually this round. Well, probably this is our clear future predictions on the third round, but well, that I actually prepared based on your competences, also some specific questions for each of you. And well, as the order was a little bit reshaped now, let's start, Tim, with you and with our European perspectives. You are expert on Europe and especially Eastern Europe. And is there even any difference between the mainland Europe and Eastern Europe, because if we look these German elections, where there was a total difference, so a dead air is returning now. It's if we see these voting records there. But well, what happens in Europe, by your opinion? Well, it's where, of course, we don't know that is Trump successful in this policy trends. So they might easily face impeachment maybe in the next 3 years after the midterms. It's optional, but as well. But well, let's say in regarding these policy changes, well, how actually Trump can force Europe even to reshape. Well, if we still was a good example made on the case of Sweden and Finland, who moved to NATO thanks to Vladimir Putin and his affair in Ukraine. Might something happen also regarding this US and Europe relationship? We will get a stronger Europe as a result.
Yeah, I mean, it could go like that. I think I should probably say the same thing now as I said when I was talking about the global order, namely that despite having a kind of professional obligation to understand these things, I don't know what the future political and security architecture in Europe is going to look like. Suffice to say that it's unlikely to be the same architecture that exists today, which came into being during the liberal era, in which specific conditions applied. For example, American support for European integration and the American security guarantee for Europe, a Russia which was geopolitically restrained and constructive, or perhaps even cordial relations at some point between the United States and China, which barely apply now and are very unlikely to apply in the next phase of European history. So things will change. I mean, what we can say for sure is that the arrival of Trump has definitely made a difference. The Europeans have heard Donald Trump say that the EU itself is an opponent, an institution, in Trump's words, set up to screw the United States, and that J.D. Vance has said the United States has nothing to offer Europe if it continues, in his view, to backslide democratically. Europeans have heard the message that the United States wants to disengage militarily from Europe and focus on the challenge from China, and will not be bound by its NATO obligations to come to the defense of the Europeans. They've been threatened by tariffs, demands that one EU member, namely Denmark, surrender sovereignty over Greenland. They've seen the United States providing support for nationalist and conservative parties that threaten Europe's liberal establishment. They've seen the United States and China impose tariffs on one another, which threaten economic globalization and one source of the EU's prosperity. And they've seen the United States assert a leadership role in Ukraine, which disregards the European interest in a Ukrainian victory and instead rewards Russia, at least in part. So this clearly makes a difference. And slightly to my surprise, I've seen the Europeans act quite decisively in coming together and working out what the new security arrangements in Europe might be, which I think, I would summarize as saying they all broadly fit with the idea of strategic autonomy, but not necessarily the kind envisaged by integrationists in Brussels. I mean, and to be specific, I think the evidence so far is this. We have seen France and the UK emerge from under the shadow of the United States to provide political and security leadership in Europe. In the process, interestingly, returning the United Kingdom to the forefront of European politics after the rupture created by Brexit. We can see the emergence of a new political security grouping, the so-called E5, encompassing the UK and France, and also Germany, Italy, and Poland, the last of which is actually particularly significant since its acknowledgement by the Europeans of Poland's status as a regional power and acknowledgement by a very traditionally Atlanticist Poland that the American security guarantee is no longer guaranteed. We have seen the UK and France trying to establish a coalition of the willing to defend Ukraine, which includes the major European actors that I've just mentioned, alongside Western allies such as Canada, Australia and New Zealand, possibly also Turkey, albeit in the face of differing opinions in Europe about whether Turkey is part of the problem or part of the solution, but also exclude states like Hungary and Slovakia, which have refused to back Ukraine in its war against Russia and are now openly siding with the United States against the EU. And we've also seen Europeans sign up to a spate of new bilateral security treaties from the so-called 100-year partnership, which London signed with Kiev in January, to various new defence cooperation agreements between the various Nordic states, all of which is taking place alongside continued efforts to try and persuade the United States to retain its military presence in Europe and its security guarantee, and a kind of newfound willingness on the part of the Europeans to spend more on defence, which is not only the precondition for European strategic autonomy, but is also the United States' main demand for maintaining its security guarantee for Europe. So with all that in mind, I think none of this points to a clear outcome, but my wager on the basis of the emerging evidence is that these will give rise in the medium term to some kind of new arrangement in Europe, possibly an organization, possibly a formalized body, but not necessarily, which is led by the main European states, which exists primarily to defend Europe's eastern border, and especially Ukraine, which will either be a member of this new security alliance or be guaranteed by it, will be supported distantly by the United States to the extent that this aligns with America's security interests in stability in Europe, which is likely to comprise regional subgroupings in places such as the Baltic, Scandinavia and southeastern Europe, and exclude states which are not committed to this new organization's goals, or at least are unwilling to pay for them. And I think I'll say one other thing, which is that I think there's still a place for NATO alongside this new organization, not least because no one actually has an interest in winding NATO up. And there will also be a place for the European Union in managing economic relations on the continent and managing economic relations with external actors such as the United States and China. But that the EU cannot be the vehicle for securing Europe in the future, given the need to involve the UK and Ukraine, and perhaps also Turkey, Norway and Iceland, and the problem created by the various neutral and wayward states among the EU's own members, with the result that the EU is likely to be sidelined in matters of grand strategy and, like NATO, somewhat decline in importance in the future. Okay, over to Bill.
Yeah, well, we turn to China now. Yeah. Okay, yeah, please. Well, it's because China is a very important factor, and I'm very happy to have a Chinese expert here. When I had a workshop at Stanford 2 years ago, there was conclusion made that two important steps is that China doesn't practice alliances, and the second one, that China doesn't make sacrifices for others. And well, now if we start to compare it, remember, so the policy Donald Trump wants to follow right now. So this is kind of love and hate relationship, which is not so simple. So China is the main enemy now. Well, even this, sometimes it shows that even Donald Trump wants to get some respect from his counterpart Xi Jinping. He was invited to this Trump inauguration, for example. So this is also many indications that Trump wants to make a deal with Xi as well. But well, how you would describe, let's say, this U.S. and China relationship in this very turmoil world we have right now?
I think the U.S.-China relationship, if we think about the bilateral relationship there, as separate from anything related to Europe or the Baltics, that relationship is likely to be in a protracted period of confrontation or at least disengagement, both in terms of economic and security policy. And so essentially when both the United States and China have been governed by coalitions domestically that are committed to international trade and globalization as a means to their own economic growth, like for example in the 1980s, right, or the 1990s, we can see the two countries cooperating quite substantially on trade and economic policy. When either country is led by a less pro-globalization coalition, as today both are, or say in the 1970s, or before the 1970s, right, then they don't cooperate. They either don't engage with one another very much at all on trade, or they actually compete over trade and economic issues. Likewise, if there's a common enemy that threatens the basic security of both countries, they can cooperate on security. We saw this obviously in the Second World War. They were both allies, and important ones, during the Second World War when confronting Japan. In the 1970s and 80s, they again cooperated quite strongly on security when confronting the Soviet Union, which both countries perceived as their primary security threat at that time. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, though, in the early 1990s, 1991, and then after this, we don't see cooperation between the US and China over security. In fact, we see increasing confrontation. And we saw this with the first, in the first instance with the 1995-96 Taiwan Straits crisis, and again and again and again and again since then. And they've searched for kind of common threats that are not state actors, right? Terrorism was supposed to be the common threat after September 11th. Climate change and disease were going to be common threats during the years when Hu Jintao and Barack Obama were trying to work together, also Obama's first term, over these. But they never really clicked. They never really brought the two countries together. And so what we'll see is this kind of increased competition on security, where spheres of influence or security interests don't match up. And actually, I think this affects Europe quite tangentially, at least with regard to security. Where we really see this as a primary issue is in the South China Sea, the area that everybody forgets, nobody thinks about, but is actually probably the most dangerous arena for this conflict of security views and interests between the US and China. A conflict that starts there accidentally or escalates inadvertently has great potential actually to affect global security, in my view. The last point I'll make about any of this has to do actually with Ukraine and Russia. I do think China is genuine in their policy of trying to maintain sort of interested neutrality, let's say, between Ukraine and Russia in the war. They have a very long-standing, China does, with Ukraine, economic, trade, and even security relationship, which is quite important to both sides. China is one of Ukraine's largest trading partners. Ukraine is one of China's largest trading partners in Europe. extraordinarily important relationship. Yet, China fundamentally cannot see Russia lose. Right? If Russia were to lose or to face a catastrophic result from the war, this would reorient great power politics in a way that would be profoundly disadvantageous to China. Not because Russia is an ally. China, as you pointed out, doesn't really have allies except for North Korea. It's the one ally they have and they don't really like. But Russia is not China's ally, but Russia is key to balancing the US and Japan on the global stage. If Russia becomes too weak or has too difficult a road ahead over the war, this is disastrous to China's security interests. And so it's actually been an incredibly difficult path to navigate for China since the beginning of the war. And I think what we can see in Europe is a kind of, I wouldn't say collapse, but a stall out, let's say, of China's overall European strategy since the Ukraine war began. I don't think it was terribly successful before that, but there was, I think, a clear strategy of trying to adopt different policies toward Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, as well as then towards what China's always seen as the core three European interlocutors in Britain, France, and Germany. And so even different between those three interlocutors they tried, in an effort basically to get European countries to approach China from different angles and to disunify whatever response they might get from Europe. It wasn't really working very well before. It's really not been working since the start of the war in 2022. And I think it's actually been downgraded in Chinese foreign policy prioritization. And so to the extent that the US is now changing its policy over the Ukraine war, over relations with Russia, over its overall relationship to Europe, this may mean that China tries to recalibrate in a different way towards Europe after, hopefully, the war is over relatively soon. If we see the rise of this new sort of European strategic autonomy or European security alliance as distinct from NATO, as distinct from the transatlantic alliance, I think that actually plays well from China's global interest in promoting a kind of multipolarity and avoiding direct bipolar confrontation with the United States where possible. That doesn't mean what it will do will be exactly what China wants it to do, but the presence of that new independent European security perspective and power is good for China's global interest and something that certainly I think Beijing would support or at least praise rather than condemn.
Thank you. And Andres, you know, Canada has elections now, and well, it's how this is the closest neighbor to United States historically. Well, of course, you have problems with, but we have problems with Latvians as well. This is not a big issue, but well, even as you already mentioned, that Trump looks like going towards this isolationism. But he has been explicitly aggressive in this in America. Well, it is like a reappearance of the Monroe Doctrine. So, it's Greenland is also very close to America. This Panama, this is a new Guantanamo in Salvador, and well, it's now his statements made against Canada. So, how it affects also the elections you have tomorrow. Well, does Trump now helps Mark Carney to win?
Well, before I get to the election, let me say Canada had the experience of Trump in the first term, which was already very traumatic, because Canada, Mexico, and the United States had a free trade agreement known as the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, which Trump upended in the first term and pressured Canada and Mexico to sign a new deal which was more favorable to the United States, but wasn't much different from the previous deal, but it was renamed as the US MCA, so the United States more prominently, and was claimed as a victory. Now, since he's come into office, Trump has said that Canada and Mexico are ripping the US off, and previous American leaders who signed trade deals with Canada and Mexico are, quote, idiots. He's the guy who signed that last. He negotiated what he claimed was the best deal ever in 2018 with Canada and Mexico. And of course, he's put it, well, I'm not going to put it down to dementia. I'll put it down to bad will. So first point is everything Trump is doing with the tariffs regarding Canada and also Mexico is illegal. But might makes right. The Canadian side has been from the beginning trying to politely suggest to all the Americans who will listen that the commercial relationship, which is one of the most important for the United States, and obviously Canada completely depends on the United States and is in a bind, that this is a win-win. But as we all know, Trump does not operate on this principle of win-win. It's a zero-sum game for him, and he has to be the winner and someone else has to lose. So this appealing to sort of mutual benefit has fallen on deaf ears. And what has happened, of course, is Trump comes out with diversionary demands, right? This fentanyl, the problem of fentanyl being smuggled in from Canada, which is minuscule. It's absurd, ridiculous, but of course that is simply an excuse to bypass Congress, which has competence regarding trade, to declare a national emergency or security powers for the president to act bypassing Congress. That also goes back to what I said in my earlier remarks about where Trump is steering the U.S. government. So that's all, and then of course chasing this shiny object. So in January, Canada and Mexico were doing everything to prove Canada appointed a fentanyl czar, because that's what Trump wanted, and it had to be called a czar for some reason. It couldn't be a chief, but it had to be a czar, who's really got nothing to do anymore at the moment, because of course that was just an excuse and distraction from the real serious object, which is, and Trump has repeated this, at first everyone thought he's trolling Canada, it's a joke, and maybe it had something personally to do with his dislike of Justin Trudeau, who was famously the guy with nice hair. It turned out that, we now have a new Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau's gone, Mark Carney's there, but Trump's desire to expand U.S. territory in the Western Hemisphere has not abated. And indeed, yesterday in Time magazine, there was an interview with Trump, and he was asked point blank, is he just trolling? Is it just a joke? And he could have used the opportunity, but he said no, he's serious about taking over Canada and Greenland and the Panama Canal as well. But I'm going to be, of course, focusing on Canada. So it's not, of course, the first time that the United States has wanted to take Canada. They failed in previous attempts, the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the one that the Americans never talk about, the one where the British and the Canadians burnt down the White House, and, well, actually a third attempt also after the Civil War, where the Irish freedom fighters, terrorists raided Upper Canada. So there have been plenty of threats to Canada in the past, but Canada's whole trading relationship, security arrangements are all being predicated over, since the Second World War at least, of being tightly integrated into one common North American system, which makes perfect sense, and made perfect sense to all the American interlocutors up to now. And this puts Canada in a real pickle, in a conundrum. The Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who is well known in this country because he was the former governor of the Bank of England, he has said that Canada has to radically reorient its trade and its relationships and its alliances. First thing he did was visit President Macron, and Prime Minister Starmer here. And it's of course also he had an audience with the King of Canada, Charles, who happens to reside here in this country. Canadians are all kind of hoping that Charles will speak up for us at some point, because it seems that, of course, he doesn't say anything unless the Prime Minister instructs him to, but that's probably one institution that Trump actually respects, is the British royal family. That status is something that he admires. But what can Canada do? Canada has elections now on Monday, and it's the Trump effect, which we've been seeing slightly played out in the German elections, with the AfD was expected to do better than they did. But in the Canadian case, it's really dramatic, because Trudeau had been in power for 10 years. It's quite natural to expect that his Liberals would lose to the Conservatives. But there's been a very dramatic reversal of fortune. The Conservatives were 20 points ahead, and now they're behind in the polls. And partly it's, of course, the Trudeau factor, but it's the rallying around the flag in response to Trump's threats. And well, Canada's not a two-party system. It's kind of a four-party system, but it's really just the Liberals and the Conservatives. And the Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, who is kind of a Trumpist in his style. He's not seriously a Trumpist. He's a career politician who's become populist and is using the techniques and the slogans. But for Canadians now, it was working really well until Trump came along. But now it's too recognizably similar to what is happening south of the border. And another effect is, I'm saying it's not a two-party system, but there's also the New Democrats, or Canada's Social Democrats. They're going to be wiped out, because to avoid a Conservative victory, people vote Liberal, who are basically the centrists. And also the Bloc Québécois, the Quebec separatists, who last year, one of the stories in Canadian domestic politics was, again, the return and rise of the Quebec separatism, which is now being derailed because of Quebecers feeling, realizing that in being independent and having to negotiate a trade deal with the United States under Trump simply will not happen. Some final remarks, and I haven't brought up the term of course, the way the US president disrespects Canada every day, in a very similar way that Putin refers to Ukraine. Canada is not a real country. It has an artificial border. And the people there, they have it horrible, right? It's Governor Trudeau, right? Governor Carney. All speak the same language anyway, right? So, and there's nothing that the US needs from Canada at all. Actually, the US depends very much on Canada for energy, gas, oil, electricity, potash for fertilizers. Canada could switch all those things off, America would be in big trouble. But Canada would also be in a jam, because Canada doesn't really have any other markets for that. And if we cut off our best, most long-standing customer, that is a huge risk for us as well. So this 51st state business, right? Trump has also mentioned this several times, and it's become, at first it was just a joke, and now what is worrisome is, like so many things Trump does, he comes up with a crazy idea and everyone dismisses it, be it in any realm of international affairs or domestic politics, and then it becomes normalized. But people start discussing, the New York Times, the Washington Post, serious pundits start describing, well, what would that actually mean? What would that actually look like? What there would be, even American Democrats are like, oh, the joke's on Trump if it's Canada's the 51st state, because Canadians will vote Democrat, right? And so that's completely missing the point. You're normalizing it, because Canada, if it were to become the 51st state, and the Prime Minister Carney has said that will never happen, but if it won't be the 51st state, it'll be like Puerto Rico. It will be a territory. And going back to what I said earlier, Canadians won't have rights. It'll be an occupied country. The United States, which takes over Canada against Canadians' will not be a democratic country either at that point, going back to what I was saying about the domestic evolution in the United States. Though there won't be any free and fair elections in the United States when Canada becomes part of the 51st state. So this kind of democratic assumptions that, well, you're going to get a whole bunch of democratic voters if you incorporate Canada's 51st state is not just false, but is a really harmful delusion to even entertain. I could go on much longer about Canada, but we're here at a conference on Baltic studies.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, before moving to question-answer session, just can you please provide a very short forecast about our two big concerns? Actually, what happens in Ukraine? Well, it has direct connection with Baltics, and also can we here as Baltic states be the next victims of the Trump and Putin deal somewhere like Ukraine is facing right now? Very shortly, please.
Me first.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think on the question of Ukraine, I think this is one thing about which I'm actually reasonably clear, because I think the outlines of a deal are now coming into place, particularly with the publication yesterday or the day before of the United States 7-point plan. So I think I can say with reasonable confidence that where this is going to end up is that Ukraine is going to be barred from joining NATO. The United States is going to recognize Russian sovereignty over Crimea and effectively recognize Russia's control over eastern Ukraine. That the United States is then going to lift sanctions on Russia, and that Ukraine will be obliged to share the profits from the extraction of its minerals and natural resources, which the US believes is a de facto security guarantee for Ukraine. And then there are open questions about whether the Europeans will deploy a peacekeeping force. I think there's a reasonable chance the Europeans will continue to arm Ukraine. And so, in summary, where I think this is ending up is an uncertain status quo in Ukraine in which neither side is satisfied with the outcome of the war. Russia will have won a partial victory, but one which falls short of its initial goal of subduing the whole of Ukraine. And the rest of Ukraine will retain its sovereignty, but will resent the loss of Crimea and the Donbass, which it will still maintain the ambition to retain, while seeking to defend itself against further Russian attack in the future, which has, of course, implications for the Baltic and the rest of Eastern Europe. And here I see different scenarios ahead, some more benign and some more malign. So to take the more benign scenario first, it is quite possible that with a resolution in Ukraine that partially satisfies Russia, that it will actually start to relax. It'll have secured a partial buffer in the Donbass, a guarantee that Ukraine won't join NATO, a kind of détente with the United States more broadly, which may end Russia's immediate fear of American encroachment on Russia's borders and engender a more laissez-faire attitude towards the Baltic states. Russia may conclude that it anyway lacks the means to take the Baltic states, given the difficulties it faced in Ukraine, where Russia has paid a huge price in blood and treasure without a clear-cut victory. To the extent that Russia still has concerns about its security, these are likely to be focused on establishing its suzerainty in the rest of Ukraine, which will consume Russia's resources rather than expanding its ambitions to the Baltic states. And I will add, I'm not actually convinced that Russia really does have the intention to make a move on the Baltic states, not least because I'm not aware of any kind of discussion in the Russian media or among politicians about retaking the Baltic states, which is what you would expect if a move on the Baltic states was in the pipeline, not least in order to generate domestic consent for this. So that's kind of the benign scenario. The more malign scenario is that Russia may take the move, may take the view that making a move on the Baltic states is a key element in restoring Russia's greatness. It may take the view that the risks of making a move on the Baltic states in the current geopolitical climate are limited, not least because of the improved terms of its relationship with the United States and the breakdown in international norms about respect for the sovereignty of states and the territorial integrity of states. Russia may take the view that the Europeans, for all their fine words, are just simply too weak, too divided, and fundamentally too decadent to represent any serious threat to Russia. And perhaps most worryingly for the Baltic states, Russia may take the view that there isn't a kind of enduring strategic logic for retaking the Baltic states as members of a hostile military alliance which is uncomfortably close to St. Petersburg, and to do so in short order before the Baltic states and its allies have built up their militaries, and while NATO's military presence in the Baltic is still fairly light. So that is the malign scenario, but I think at the risk of taking a view which simply splits the difference between these two extreme scenarios, my wager is that Russia is probably going to take a middle course. I think at this stage it's unlikely that Russia will mount a kind of Georgian-style invasion or Ukrainian-style invasion of the Baltic states in the absence of a clear strategic logic and given the risks of doing so. But I also think it's unlikely that Russia is going to leave the Baltic states in peace to the extent that they represent a threat to Russia and to the extent that Russia has some freedom of action to counter this threat. So where I think this is going to end up is external pressure and harassment on the Baltic states of the kind that Russia has practiced in other parts of the former Soviet Union and indeed in the Baltic states themselves in recent years, including the whole myriad of hybrid warfare techniques from cyber warfare to attacks on critical infrastructure, violations of the Baltic's airspace, manipulation of their internal politics, taking advantage of the Russian minorities in Estonia and Latvia. And if the Baltic states disturb Russia too much, more threatening moves such as massing troops on the Baltic states' borders, alongside potentially an escalation in Russia's demands on the Baltic states from adopting a more friendly stance, a foreign policy stance towards Russia, to demands for better treatment for their Russian minorities, and potentially an insistence that foreign troops leave the territory of the Baltic states. So not the worst outcome, but also not the best, and certainly the implication being of worrying times ahead.
Okay, thank you. Bill and Anders, just if you have a short reply, only a few sentences, please, because we save some time for questions.
Asking what is the...
about Ukraine and Baltics.
Oh, I mean, the outlines of what has now been mooted as the U.S. position on a peace plan, so-called, for Ukraine, have been discussed privately and in back channels for quite some time, almost since the beginning of the war, actually, that there would be a kind of freezing of things at the status quo. The one element of this that I find new and potentially problematic, certainly from Ukraine's point of view, very problematic, but also potentially from the perspective of others in Europe, is the formal recognition by the United States of Russian sovereignty over Crimea. That had not been in all of the previous versions of this that I'd heard rumors of. And so I think we'll see what happens, but I would assume that it's quite likely that this will be accepted in some form with or without that new provision. And what that means for the future of Ukraine, I'm not sure in terms of the new provision being there or not. What I think is really key about Russia and politics in the region is how the end of the war will play domestically in Russia, which I don't know, and I don't know if anybody really has a very clear sense of that. And then secondly, how long does Putin really have? Right? I mean, he, by actuarial tables, probably has about 10 to 12 years that he could remain in power. But how long does he really have politically left in power, and what's his end game? Domestically, not internationally, right? Because most great power foreign policy is domestically driven. Those are the questions I think we really need to be thinking about, more so perhaps even than whether it makes strategic sense to attack the Baltics or do X or Y with regard to what's left of Ukraine or other states. What does this mean domestically for the Russian regime, and how will they manage that?
Well, if I can just pick up on that exactly that last point, that Putin only has a few years left as Trump, biologically, hopefully, that actually is distressing, because that means they see themselves as, I mean, Trump started talking about expanding America in his old age, right? And Putin, we all assumed, most of us, I think, assumed was just a kleptocrat who was interested in enriching himself, but it turns out Russian imperial expansionism, both of them want a historical legacy of expanding their state, both the US and Russia. And at that age, you said they don't have much time left, they're going to keep going. Because to parry what you were saying, the first speaker, I don't think NATO expansion is really a driving concern for the Russians. It's imperial expansion of recovering lost territory. So I believe if there is this ceasefire alongst these lines that are proposed by the Americans, this will be just encouragement for the Russians to push further. How and when and how far is another matter, but I think for most people who study Russian foreign policy, it's clear that the Russians go as far until they reach resistance. And if they reach this point where their wishes are granted by the American administration and sanctions are lifted so they can start rearming themselves again, that puts them puts the Baltic states in a very dangerous position.
Okay, we might have a few questions. Well, now it's, yeah, please.
Thanks, all professors. I have two questions particular. One is to Professor Hurst and another is to Professor Kasekamp. And to Professor Hurst, you mentioned that the US is now reorienting very obviously from Europe to East Asia in order to engage in full-scale kind of strategic competition with China. But on the other hand, you also mentioned that China is in favor of the situation of the fragmentation of the global order and the so-called multipolarity order it was willing to see. So do you think that the US, even it claimed it is reorienting to engage in competition with China, it's sabotaging its own agenda by, renouncing the kind of global order it helped to create? And that is to your question. And additional question is that, do you think that China will take the advantage of the US commitment undermined and the US kind of isolationism to take over Taiwan as a means to achieve its so-called great national rejuvenation under Trump's administration? How do you evaluate the risk? And to Kasekamp, Professor Kasekamp, actually you have a very great point. I first heard that you mentioned if the US really tried to attack or kind of incorporate Canada and even to take over Greenland and the Panama Canal, you think it will no longer be a kind of democracy. So can you elaborate a little bit about this idea? Because will it be a test to the so-called democratic peace theory that is proved to be very correct until now? Yes, so can you elaborate on it? Thank you.
Okay, please respond first.
Yeah, okay. So I'll just say very quickly on a couple of things, those two questions. The first question is basically about whether the US is sabotaging its own agenda vis-a-vis sort of its goals globally, and particularly in terms of its strategic competition with China. Yes, it definitely is. It is seriously compromising its agenda in many ways, not least the tariffs, not least undermining NATO and everything else. All of this is tremendously destabilizing to the US objectives, or at least what I understood to be the US objectives for the last several decades in global security policy. Will that play to China's advantage? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. But to the extent that it erodes any kind of unipolar hegemony to which the United States could vestigially remain a claimant to, that's better for China to see this sort of erosion of US dominance in the world order. The second question, more pointedly, will this embolden or incentivize China to try to attack Taiwan? No, I don't think so. The Taiwan Strait security situation has been in long-term stable equilibrium since 1958. I see nothing really to destabilize that now. There's a lot of noise, a lot of signaling going back and forth. The two sides understand each other very well. I don't think this is a particularly tense time in that relationship. Certainly not as tense as we saw 30 years ago with the Taiwan Straits crisis that I mentioned in my earlier remarks, where there's much greater danger along China's periphery is in the South China Sea and potentially, depending on the way things go, in the Korean Peninsula.
That was very encouraging to hear about Taiwan, actually, because picking up on where I was speaking about earlier, about the ceasefire and the implications for the Baltic region, I think the main sort of big takeaway for the international order is if the US recognizes Crimea as part of Russia, then the whole post-1945 order is upset, right? That you can't change borders by force. So that has big implications, and you would think that it plays out also in regarding Taiwan. I'm reassured that it's I think not. But the direct question to me about democratic peace theory and US designs on Canada, it goes right back to the first round where I characterized that the United States is moving in the direction of not being a democratic country. And if it takes over Canada against the will of Canadian citizens, then that completely undermines democratic peace theory. It's pretty straightforward, right? If I understood the question properly. Yes.
It will not, kind of like threat the integrity of democratic peace theory, right?
No, when the US takes over Canada, it's no longer a democracy.
Yeah, but I think long before that, the US has already not been a democracy. If it really comes to that, the final step to take over Canada by force or even take over Greenland and Panama Canal, isn't it?
I would just repeat myself. I think the US it'll be determined in the next few months whether the US remains a democracy. We're seeing that right now, the rule of law, will it break? I mean, will the administration yield to Supreme Court orders or not? If they don't, then that's the slide of, then it's just a few more steps and it's gone. And it's pretty easy to, if the president issues illegal orders and he has immunity, then he can issue troops to Greenland or Canada, which he wouldn't be doing otherwise. I mean, breaking all sorts of international treaty obligations which the Congress has ratified.
Of course, would they obey? That's the next question.
Would they obey?
Maybe the troops won't obey those orders.
That would be our hope,
yeah.
But everything that's been happening in the US seems to suggest otherwise, because looking at it from outside of the US, okay, there's been protests in the last few weekends, but I think most people outside of the US have been astonished how they've been so meek and how it's been enabled by all of the establishment. All the guardrails have sort of failed. Everyone's just gone along with it. Congress has abdicated all of its powers. And I mean, it's already a cliche to say that 1933, why didn't the Germans do anything, right? Well, now we know, right?
Okay, thank you. There was more, please, yeah, you first and then you. You, gentlemen.
Boris Kashnikov, Polis. I would like to ask Professor Kasekamp, suppose the United States is moving in the direction of fascism and Putin is ready to embrace his brother, spiritual brother. Does it mean that we are facing the emergence of fascist international? Who else will join the club? And would it mean that the fascist state do not wage war on each other, like liberal states were not supposed to wage war on each other?
So there's a there's a democratic peace theory and there's a fascist state peace theory, that they're partners. Well, I don't think so, because I think that what was outlined earlier as the benign version, right, where the US would accommodate the Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, and I think that the Kremlin is not going to stop undermining the United States. I mean, the United States might think that it is giving concessions to appease Russia, and then we'll have a beautiful new relationship, we'll drop the sanctions, but the United States intelligence, the FBI, the Director of National Intelligence, they're disarming United States services, putting in incompetent loyalists, so the United States is leaving itself pretty defenseless to, I don't think the Russians are going to just turn off their interference, espionage, and basically undermining the US system just because, they like Trump. They're using him, they're playing him. He wants to be liked.
Okay, you had, please.
Thank you. My name is Airdas. I'm a PhD student at Georgetown University, and I have a question. You mentioned that we should not pursue EU as a security actor because we have those 4 countries that seem to be not very well integrated or not willing to. But the Trump effect also changed the situation. For example, in Norway or in Iceland, we are at historic high support for the EU accession. Ukraine, at the same time, is already in the process to accessing the EU. Maybe given the fact that the European Union has a strong market and can enable, for example, defense procurement and other things, maybe Britain should just rejoin the EU. The other question would be, I was a little bit surprised when you mentioned that there is no rhetoric in Russia about kind of recapturing the Baltic states. So I wanted to ask if you watch sometimes, for example, Первый канал, because there is this kind of, there are some journalists like Solovyov and Skabeva who are very much and very often talking about possibility of recapturing the Baltic states, and this is still known to be a Russian propaganda, official propaganda channel. So if you could comment, thank you.
Okay,
to be clear, I didn't say the EU shouldn't be the vehicle for whatever new security arrangement emerges in Europe. What I said is I think it's unlikely to be because of the various problems I identified. Certainly there are 4 neutral states within the EU who are not giving their permission for the EU to transform itself into a security organization. Then you have Hungary and Slovakia, which are politically opposed to the political objectives of the other EU members. And then you have to accommodate the fact that you have at least 4, maybe 5 external players, Britain, Turkey, Ukraine, Norway and Iceland, which are likely to want to be part of some new security arrangement in opposition to Russia, but are not part of the EU. So that is the kind of, let's say, technical problem that stands in the way of the EU realizing Ursula von der Leyen's vision of the EU as, some sort of European version of NATO. But, personally, my view is if the EU could overcome those problems, then let it become that vehicle. On the case of the Baltic states, I'm interested to hear what you say, and I'll go and check it out. And I'm happy to stand corrected if there really is that kind of conversation taking place in Russia. And indeed, I'll be more than interested. I'll be very worried to hear if that is the case.
Can I just add, I think you asked about, you also mentioned Ukrainian EU accession, right? If NATO accession is off the table and that the EU accession could be kind of a compensation, no. Without a security guarantee, I don't think EU accession is going to happen. And without a security guarantee also, who's going to invest in Ukraine? The refugees aren't going to want to return. There's no guarantee that Russia, as I tried to make the point, will be satisfied with what it has. All past Russian history kind of tends to show that it will take its gains, recoup, and if there's no resistance, will push further. It might not mean immediately militarily, but it will try to destabilize the Ukrainian political process, influence it through sort of corruption in its own agents, and make Ukraine generally as miserable as possible.
Yeah, okay, please, last question, basically.
Hi, Ainus Lašas, University of Technology. I'm curious to know your opinion about Germany. With some changes and some new expectations of Germany as being, maybe not the only power in Europe that matters, but as sort of the new, renewed power in Europe that matters, and with the interests, security interests also in the Baltic, in particular in Lithuania specifically. Do you see the possibility of Germany really becoming some sort of counterforce to Russia and being more assertive militarily and otherwise? Thank you.
Yeah, my short answer is yes. I mentioned Germany in the context of this emerging E5 grouping. I mentioned Germany in the context of this coalition of the willing in Ukraine. The very fact that I'm talking about this says something quite important about Germany, which is that, perhaps for the first time since the end of the Second World War, it is starting to assert itself as a security actor in Europe, albeit in tandem with European peers, and that this will make a difference. Germany is potentially a formidable military actor, particularly if it actually does start to spend at least 2% of its GDP on defence, which will leave it with one of the largest armies in Europe. And its role is bound to be significant in that context.
Let me be more pessimistic again. That might be an aspiration now which they're not going to fulfill because they're going to be one of the main casualties in Trump's trade war. And also, the Germans, the main thing driving their economy is, right, the auto industry. That's going to get wiped out. Trump's tariffs. Chinese have taken over the electric vehicle business. So I'm glad that Germany has finally sort of woken up to the importance of defense, but I'm pessimistic that I think the German economy is going to be in decline, and it won't be able to fulfill these aspirations, which of course would be a good thing if Germany could. It would be wonderful for Europe and the Baltic, but I think the economic conditions, because of the trade war, because of the Chinese dominance in electric vehicles, the German auto industry is kaput in the long run.
So I think it's time to close the official part of this panel. Thank the panelists, thanks the audience, and of course we are welcome to continue this free discussion afterwards. But this was happy to be here at Cambridge at this time, and it's very, very turbulent issues we faced. Thank you. and just to panelists.